Yes, that's right. You read the title correctly. I'm once again making a West Point video.
Holy moly.
But just fair warning, it's probably not what you're expecting. So I've been doing some reading, and I've been doing some thinking, and I've come to the conclusion that West Point exists in the realm of hyperreality. Now, I know what you're thinking.
What the hell is even that?
Just bear with me. It'll make sense as I go on. So strap in and enjoy the hyperreality of West Point barracks rooms. So a few years ago when I was still a cadet, I made this video that did a quick once over of what barracks rooms are like at West Point and how they have to be meticulously set up and all the little rules that go along with it. So the closer button, the BAG drawer, etc. And this is how rooms were set up every single day to be inspected in the mornings. And of course, I mentioned how the beds are made very, very, very specifically to exact dimensions, and that if you actually to flip it over, it would probably just be duct tape and bungee cords holding everything together, and that it's more for show and you don't actually sleep in your bed. All right, so I've set the stage about West Point rooms. What the hell does that have anything to do with this thing called hyperreality? I got you. So in 1981, the French postmodernist Jean Baudrillard published Simulacra and Simulation. Fun fact, it's a movie that inspired The Matrix. And the spark notes of the spark notes of the spark notes of this, and please no one kill me if you've already read this book because of how simple I'm making it. One of his main messages was that society has progressed past the point of anything actually having any genuine meaning. Anything that you think of as being real or accurate, reflecting reality is really just a reflection of a copy of a reflection, to the point where it's all just self-referential and nothing's real anymore. Which might sound confusing, but a good analogy of it is to think about fruit cereal. So like fruit cereal is like the epitome of fruit, right? The box has all these pretty little cartoons about these perfect fruit, and then when you bite into it, it's like the most amazing, tasteful thing that you've ever eaten and would probably send anyone born in the 1800s into a stroke because of how intense it is. And so if you actually go and then eat real fruit, and you'd notice that it's kind of bruised and shaped weird and not nearly as perfect as it is on the box, and then when you bite into it, it's not nearly as good as the actual cereal. The fruitiness of the real fruit isn't as fruity as this fruit cereal. Your expectations of what fruit is has not been met by actual fruit, which should have been the standard, if you really think about it. So it's fruit doesn't taste what it's supposed to taste like in your mind anymore. And that supposed to taste like taste is really just some idea that you get from eating fruit cereal that's not really based on anything. Just kind of your own interpretations of what fruit should taste like. It's all just a referential idea of it all. And he says this occurs in 4 stages: the faithful image, perversion of reality, the masking of the absence of reality, and pure simulacrum. We'll return to these in a bit, so I gotta explain some stuff first. And just a quick note, the things I'm saying here is not a criticism of West Point. This is something that happens all over the world in every little aspect of society. I'm just using this as an example because it's an easy thing for me to talk about. But like I said, if it applies to fruit cereal and West Point, you can imagine it applies to almost anything. So I remember when I was first applying to West Point many years ago, I would always see all the cadets in their uniforms just doing West Point things. And you could do this too, especially if you're less involved with the institution. You more so see a uniform with a person in it rather than a person wearing a uniform, if that makes sense. And by virtue of them wearing that uniform, your brain automatically just switches to all the heuristics you have of what West Point itself reinforces through its own self-representation. So just by virtue of existing, there is an idea of West Point, what West Point should be. Almost like the fruitiness of fruit, right? And this is just a byproduct of its incredibly rich history, the amazing thing its cadets have done. And then of course the thing that happens at every institution, which is just you can't separate the problems from their solutions, especially with a retrospective view. So all the small and kind of unimportant, boring things are typically forgotten. The good things are remembered, and then all the bad things are usually coupled with a solution that came apart with them. So like if there was something major big or a controversy that happened and eventually does get solved, when you're looking at it in the past, you're not able to uncouple it from its own solution. So even the bad things turn into good things. And that's not dishonest in any way. It shows progression and honesty in the system, but it just makes it harder to have a more objective view of the past. The thing that would go in hand with this is what I would call kind of the continuation of what the ideal cadet is. And that's the ideal cadet that's shown to cadets themselves. So all over campus, there's statues and paintings and old photographs of cadets just doing things. But I always got the impression when I was there that they were doing things that were harder than anything I had to do while I was there. Their uniform was always a little bit better fitted and more uncomfortable than mine. Kind of the whole, you know, uphill both ways on the way to school thing with your parents. And this is kind of reinforced by the old grad phrase, the Corps has. And I know this begs the question, The Corps has what? But there is no what. It's just a phrase that means that an old grad has heard something that they believe makes the academy easier than it was when they were there, and so they say the Corps has. So for example, when I found out that the barracks that I spent many nights sweating my absolute ass off because we didn't have air conditioning in the summer was finally getting air conditioning, my only response, of course, was the Corps has. So in the past, these cadets were always like cadetier than I was, if that makes sense. They had more of that West Point cadetness than I ever would have. Okay, so back to my rant that West Point exists in hyperreality. So the way that barracks rooms are set up is dictated by this thing called the BAG, or Barracks Alignment Guide, which is a stupidly long PDF file that you'd have to follow to the T in order to pass room inspections every morning. And even more closely on SAMI weekends, which just ruined your life. My favorite rule of the Barracks Alignment Guide is that if you have a plant in the room, all cadets must agree on the plant. And if they don't, in theory, and that was leaked, that one of the cadets didn't like the plants, that could be used as a deficiency for the next inspection. Imagine failing an inspection because one of your roommates didn't like a plant. So the guide changes a little bit every year, or at least it did when I was there. There are always a couple little minor, seemingly insignificant changes that were made. And those changes were typically made by cadets themselves. And anytime those changes were made, the question had to be asked, what would make sense here? What should a West Point room look like? Given all the traditions and cultural norms of the place, what fits within the paradigm that's already been set? So, we've established how West Point presents itself to itself, and then how that representation of itself is then influenced into how the rooms are set up. So let's get on to the juicy stuff, shall we? So back to those 4 stages of how you reach hyperrealism. In the beginning, there was the first West Point room with its rules of tidiness, neatness, and appearance, and naturally from this is where they established the first set of rules published on how rooms were to be set up. And those original rules created the original West Point room. This original set of standards and rooms were for the most part just made from scratch and represented a genuine idea that they were reaching for on how the rooms should be. Eventually, of course, the rooms changed over time, but how they were to be set up was still rooted in the original set of standards set for the room. So while the physical settings were changed, standards, though adapted, were still firmly rooted in the original. And this represents the second stage, the perversion of reality. So there have been little changes and additions, modifications, that kind of thing, but it's still mostly recognizable as just adaptations from the original. Eventually though, all of the original rooms are cleared out, either by barracks being demolished or the building being completely gutted and rebuilt. Of course though, that doesn't mean the room standards are gone, it just means they drastically changed, though still somewhat resembling how they were in the second stage. They still had to represent the historical context set by the very original, though none of the original actually remains. This is the third step, the masking of the absence of reality. The buildings that inspired the first set of standards no longer existed. The people who had written them had literally died of old age. However, there still was the required representation of this ideal, though that idea had literally no base in physical reality by that time. Over the decades, the standards evolved and changed, still striving for that presented ideal. However, it became more and more self-referential, separated more and more from the original to the point where the revisions to the standards are just revisions of revisions, which themselves are just revisions of revisions of revisions. You get the idea. So finally, we can see why the West Point bed exists in the hyperreal. Something that started out in the 1800s for a cadet to cuddle up and rest is now a covered mattress that is used more for decoration than actual sleep, because the rules regarding the bed are so strict and expectations so high that it's anything but feasible to make the bed too standard every single day. Though at one time that was the norm, and gradually went away over the 2 centuries. I know when I was there that if you actually slept in your bed, you would probably be forcibly admitted into a mental hospital because something was just not right with you. And to further the point that the bed exists in hyperreality that has no reflection in physical reality, the one time I actually slept in it, the day before I graduated, it wasn't even comfortable. Talk about postmodern disappointment.